Welcome, members, directors, and guests to the ANZGITA 2020 AGM. My name is Barb Hines, and I help ANZGITA with marketing, funding, and events. And today with, hang on, with some housekeeping notes. You took my stuff. That's all right. This reimagined AGM will be conducted by Frank Eastoff, and he'll act as our IT engineer, and he'll manage the questions afterwards and recording of this webinar. Finley will start the formal AGM in a few minutes and report on the year's activities and take questions. At 6:25, he will announce the recognition awards for the year, followed by the introduction of our guest speaker, Michael Wesley. We'll keep the webinar to an hour with opportunities to ask questions after Professor Wesley's talk. And at the conclusion of the webinar, if there is a desire to keep talking. Frank will field as many questions as time allows, which can be asked by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin though, I'd like to tell you about an interesting marketing and funding activities we've had this year. First up is our Suck It To Me project. And I'd like to put a big shout out thank you to Chris Hare for such a great idea. In conjunction with the Sydney Sock Project, we've designed 3 different types of socks, one for doctors, one for nurses, and one general medical one that represents health in the Pacific. And we think there's a good international market for these. They'll be available internationally in a couple of weeks, directly from the Sydney Sock Project for $15.95 a pair. And they'll be presented in some recycled packaging. We'll also present them at trade shows when we can get back to trade shows, and perhaps give them out as thank you gifts to donors. We look forward to seeing our creations in person, and I'm sure there's a gutsy doctor or nurse in your hospital or clinic well deserving of a pair of socks for Christmas. Yeah. Next up, we have a presentation that we've worked on. It's a 10-slide PowerPoint presentation entitled About ANZGITA, Helping Save Lives, to inform people about ANZGITA and the good work we do. And it's also a platform for you to share your experiences if you've been lucky enough to be one of the trainers. We'd like to ask you to connect with your colleagues for as little as 10 minutes at a work event, maybe during lunch hour, in a training session, or maybe any other interested parties like gut clubs. It'll be available as a slide deck and also as a flip book for iPad use in smaller groups. We'll send everybody a link in the spring newsletter next week. So let us know how you go. And better yet, send me a link if you've recorded your own presentation and we'll make you a star. Lastly, we have the ANZGITA annual report, which will be posted on the homepage and on our website and sent to members as a flip book. Sorry, we're always really keen to hear from you and your feedback, and we're happy to help anytime. So on behalf of the ANZGITA team, we'd like to thank you for your support. And now I'll pass the webinar over to our fearless leader, Finlay McRae. Thank you.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to the opening of the AGM here of ANZGITA. It's been a different year for us, as it has for everyone, with the disruption caused by COVID, and of course that has been mostly evident in terms of our lack of capacity to run our in-country programs across the Indo-Pacific region. And as a consequence, we've developed a lot of online training tools. We did have one in-country activity just before COVID closed us down in March with our program in the Solomons, which just managed to escape the lockdown and went very well. So if we can just look at the first slide, Frank. Next, I've just got two slides. This first one represents what we've been doing in the online space. While Frank's getting it organised, I'll keep talking to it. And I'd like to acknowledge particularly Chris Hare, who's really driven the online training, pivoting our activities into online training. Pivoting is the key word in the COVID era. And you can see here a number of initiatives that have been developed since, well, before COVID became it, but have taken on an accelerated phase since we've been in COVID. Chris, of course, has been running the ANZGITA Gastroenterology Pacific Basin Zoom almost webinars for quite some time now. In fact, we've just had the 22nd webinar, and they are very successful in that they connect the region right across the Pacific from very isolated places through this go back one, Frank, through the webinar process. And just flick back, yeah. This is supported by the University of Hawaii, Christina Heiger, who manages that terrifically from a technical point of view. And the presentations are bookended by opportunities for the participants from across the Pacific to focus on their own local problems as they come across them, and case-based discussions. So it's a very interactive process that Chris Hare really manages fantastically well. Chris has identified the need for training for junior resident doctors across the Pacific who are not under the umbrella of a university, because their training is really quite, lacks a lot in terms of exposure to more experienced doctors to help them train. And so he's going to focus on that group. Samoa has been an area in particular that's recognised the need for that sort of support, and it's getting full support from Fiji, even though Samoa and those other sites are not directly under the Fiji National University. Mark Norrie has developed a really good WhatsApp endoscopy group focused in the Solomons, and we think it's going so well that we should extend it across the whole Indo-Pacific region. We'd like to develop a GI nursing teleprogram, so that's on our agenda. And we're also looking at the possibility of virtual live endoscopy mentoring with teams from Australia looking over the shoulders of remote endoscopists across the Pacific. So these are all activities that are remote and can be done online, and they're all real saviours in the context of the COVID restrictions that we face. So if you can move on, Frank. I'd just like to move on with a couple of other aspects. I'll move on to this first. I was going to mention this a bit later, but we've been privileged to join forces with the World Gastroenterology Organisation Research Interest Group, and they have been very supportive of ANZGITA. In fact, they view ANZGITA as the lead organisation for training in the developing world. So we've been frequently put in the position of piloting their ideas for research activities, particularly around endoscopy. So the 3 or 4 that we have in mind there, well, first of all, we've already conducted the ATP monitoring of endoscopes for cleaning and disinfection with Di Jones, Mei-Ling Perman and Des Ledden and Mark Topazium from the WGO. We're about to install the Provation as an electronic database recording system in Fiji, which will be the first one that the WGO has positioned across their 23 training centres. And Peter Catalaris is leading with Des Ledden a Helicobacter antibiotic resistance testing program supported by his faculty in the University of Sydney and also from Portugal. So we've really had quite a lot of activity and interest in that interactive space with ANZGITA leading the field as far as the WGO is concerned for those activities. Just a couple of other things to say. During this last year, we've established an advisory group, and most, if not all, of the advisory group members are on this Zoom call for the AGM, and I'm very pleased that they've all contributed terrifically at various stages. It's a group that I foresaw would be able to help us with advice at different points of challenge as we move through our journey. So I'm very pleased that all of the people we invited agreed readily to join the advisory group, including Professor Joe Sung from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Kay El Go from Kuala Lumpur, Des Ledden himself from Canada, Ian Roberts-Thompson from Adelaide, one of our founding participants for ANZGITA programs 12 or 13 years ago, and Michael Wesley, who's the Vice-Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne, who'll be giving his talk later on this evening. So I welcome all those bodies and thank them very much for their participation in the advisory group. Just like to flip back to perhaps our latest Indo-Pacific site, and that's the Federated States of Micronesia. I was privileged to be the first trainer that went there in November last year, and we were very pleased with the way that ran. I think it was the first time that early trainees in Fiji actually took over training roles as trainers in a different site, in a distant site, that is in the Federated States of Micronesia. So Mei Ling Perman and Mariah from Suva were key trainers in that exercise, and we think we'll be continuing our training activities in Pohnpei and the Federated States of Micronesia. So I'd just like to close by saying, as far as the board's concerned, we've had a retirement. Alison Byrne retired after some years. She was instrumental in helping us to raise funds from her professional background. So we're very thankful to Alison for her participation with the board. She's moved on for personal reasons. And of course, the whole board is a fantastic board, contributing their various skills across different domains of their expertise and interest to the functions and success of the board as we move forward. Tony Clark done a fantastic job with logistics and organising all our training programs. Chris Hare's role I've mentioned already. Frank is the foundation and glue for our whole organisation, and everybody else who I won't mention by name have all been tremendously supportive. So finally, I just wanted to thank our sponsors who've been always come to the fore when we've looked for help, and have been wonderfully helpful in terms of supporting with their own in-kind contributions to the activities across the Indo-Pacific region in which we work, providing equipment, providing logistics, providing endoscopes, providing endoscopic accessories. So thank you all to those: Boston Scientific, Cantel, CR Surgitech, CR Kennedy, Gencat, GISA, JGH Foundation, Marfu, Olympus, Pentax, CISA and Whiteley Corporation. So thank you very much. So that's all I have to say. I would like to direct your attention to the officers' reports, which are with the papers or on the website anyway, and you're welcome to read them. They all provide an excellent outline of our various activities, from the programs to our solid budgetary status with our excellent treasurer, Alan Studley. We're in a sound position to move forward, notwithstanding the restrictions in the COVID era. Thank you very much. I will leave it at that, and we can move on.
Finn, we need to do apologies.
Oh dear, yes.
We got Bernie Lawrence sends his apology. That's right. The one I've received.
Thank you, Frank. And the previous minutes, we need to,
Yep.
The minutes are available. Do we have a mover?
Yes, I move that, Finn.
We have a seconder.
Yes, I'm happy to second it. Tony Clark.
Good.
Right, then Finn, we have to vote. So there's a poll for people to vote if they're in favour, accepting the minutes. Give people a bit of time.
You're supposed to click on it, are you, Frank?
Yes, you click yes or no, Finn.
Mine's not registering.
Is it? All right, sorry.
Everybody else's?
Yeah, I'm getting lots of votes.
Okay.
Okay.
Panelists can't vote.
Maybe the panelists can't vote, is that right?
Oh yeah, or maybe they can't, Finn. Yep, good point. Okay, righto. Okay, motion, I've got 33 in favour, none against, Finn, so that motion's passed.
Good. That's the minutes.
Yep.
We voted on. Right. So can we move on to the election of the...
No, the next one, Finn's about the accepting the reports of the officers.
formal acceptance of the reports that are available to you. All those in favour, oh, does somebody like to move that?
Yeah, it's Mark Norrie here. I move that motion.
And seconder?
Yes, it's Di Jones here. I'm happy to second that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mark.
We need people to vote again, please. Oh, still coming? Okay, I think that's it. So that Vin, yeah, we had 33 in favour, none against. So that motion's passed as well.
Good.
Okay.
So the next item is the election of directors.
Yep.
We've received 4 nominations for directors and there were 4 places to fill. So and we don't have any other nominations, is that correct?
That's correct.
So the nominations that have been received for the 4 places are Alan Fraser, Chris Hare, Tony Clark and me. So I declare them all duly elected for a 2-year term.
Okay.
So I don't think that requires a vote, does it?
No, it doesn't, Finn. No.
Now, I'm going to be ticked off because I stepped a bit outside, didn't I, Barb?
Don't think it really matters, Finn.
It all got in there. It's good.
But it has gained some time, I think. Barb, you'll be pleased to know. I think we're
You
here.
have.
So, yeah. So you were happy with your comments? You didn't have anything more you wanted to
no.
add? Okay.
No. We could, I think we could either take questions now, because that was...
Yep. Finn, if anyone's got a question, they can type it into the Q&A button for you. And
there is 2 questions there. Can you monitor those, Frank?
Yeah, no, they're earlier. That's okay. They were just questions about getting set up.
Okay. Any questions of the chairman's report and the officers' reports?
Looks like you're going to get off scot-free, Finn.
Yeah. Perhaps I can draw out Alan, if you wouldn't mind. Are you on the line, Alan?
Oh, no, he is, Finn, but I'd have to find... Yep, you want him... Here we go. Right, there you go. He can talk to you, yes?
I just wanted to get perhaps Alan's overview of the financial strength or otherwise of the organisation for the AGM purposes, seeing we've got a little bit of time up our sleeve.
I can't get him to unmute. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Right.
The organisation. Yep, the organisation is in a very good position. Its expenditure this year just past has been low. As a result, primarily of COVID. So we continue to take funds from philanthropists and other donors. We have managed the expenses, and the only other thing to report really is that we now have 5 years history from the very first transaction of ANZGITA when it was a registered and incorporated organisation. We now have 5 years history sitting in a database, Xero database, and we're able to review those transactions that have taken place in the past, look at particular programs, and it's been of use to Frank and I as we compare year on year the monies that we've spent in certain locations. I don't think there's anything else to add. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
That's good. Thank you, Owen. Well, we've got a choice now. We are running slightly ahead of schedule, so we could move on, and we've got the award recognitions to do. But we could also, if I think we've got time, is Joseph on the line, and KL go, and perhaps Des?
Hang on, Finn. I need to unmute them if they are. There's KL go, Finn. He should be able to hear you now.
Yes, I can hear you all the time.
Yeah, we don't expect you to have.
Can you hear me?
What you might, just leaving you the opportunity to say what you might want to, KL, all the way from Kuala Lumpur.
Well, just to congratulate the organisation and your good self, Finn, for having a very good year and many activities, as I can see that you all carried out over the past 1 year, and very many innovative projects as well. So just to register my congratulations to the ANZGITA for doing such a good job.
Thank you, KL. I see Des there. Can we uncover Des?
Yes, Des has got his microphone on.
Des, of course, been critical to those interactions with the WGO in the research sphere. So, Des, it's great to have you part of the advisory group.
Great, thanks, Finlay and Frank. It's been really my pleasure to have the opportunity to work with ANZGITA over the last 12 to 18 months. As chair of the WGO research group, I'm constantly looking for partner organizations with whom we can do some work. And I have to say that ANZGITA stands out as a unique group in terms of its function and its activities. And I think it's partly due to the people, quite honestly, who are committed and involved in ANZGITA, particularly yourself and Frank, of course, and all of the others, and Chris Hare. And it's the processes, and the processes which I think make ANZGITA functionally so important are the level of trust that I see between the organization and the sites around the Pacific where ANZGITA engages. And it's those two things really, people who are committed to the mission and the level of trust and comfort that's built up amongst the group that really makes it a unique situation. And it's been a pleasure to work with ANZGITA on some of these projects. I think they're close to fruition, and we hope that within 6 or 12 months we'll have some very tangible results for you. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
And thank you, Des, for all your support and wise counsel. It's always been there for us. So thank you very much.
And Finn, we've got Ian Roberts-Thompson as well.
Yeah. Ian, are you available?
I am, Finn. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Well, congratulations on your efforts despite COVID-19. I think you're really expanding into the Pacific, Finn, and I suppose one question is that where you see the majority of your work over the next 2 or 3 years, or do you anticipate coming back into Asia proper in time? So anyway, I represent also the JGH Foundation, and we are pleased to continue providing some funds for your organisation, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. So thank you for the opportunity, and maybe you can answer the question as to where you see your major efforts going over the next couple of years.
Yes, just briefly, Ian, we've always been an organisation that responds to invitations rather than pushes ourselves where we're not necessarily invited. And so our engagement everywhere has been opportunistic in that setting. We're certainly in Timor-Leste in a big way. We've made strong overtures and efforts in Nepal, and it's been quite, as you'll read in the report, that's not been smooth sailing in terms of training processes. And we were very keen to go into Papua New Guinea, and were all set up to go there, but then we got a bit of a cold shoulder in the process from Papua New Guinea and DFAT. So that's on the back burner, but we're ready and willing to re-engage in Papua New Guinea if we're invited. So we never go anywhere unless we're invited. And that hasn't been a problem, and still not a problem. So as far as the rest of Asia, Joseph, I'll give Joseph the floor a little while. Joseph suggested we link up with the Hong Kong Endoscopy Society, who've also got initiatives across the region, and we might do that. Much of the rest of Asia is pretty well furnished with endoscopists and training and don't need us, although there are still certainly other pockets. I didn't mention Myanmar. We've had issues with Myanmar, but we're likely to restart in Myanmar next year once we get firm assurances of government support, i.e. Myanmar government support to do it. Joseph, do you want to just chime in?
Yeah, the Hong Kong Society of Digestive Endoscopy has a long history of doing training of endoscopy and ERCP in China as well as in Southeast Asia. The country that we have covered include China, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, and recently we have also went to Myanmar. So when you mention about any chance of collaboration, I suggest that the two societies can perhaps do something together, and therefore it was tabled in the council meeting of Hong Kong Society, and all the council members are very happy to work with this society. And only that right now we are not going anywhere because of the COVID-19 pandemics. But in the future, if there is any opportunity that we can join hands together by sending teachers to go to places that we are both interested in, we can do that. This is I think a genuine spirit of a collaboration between Australia, New Zealand, and Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. That's terrific. It's great to have you on board. I'd like to just move on to the awards recognition presentations and congratulate and thank the 3 awardees who are from the nursing side, Anne van der Loor. So Anne has had 15 years experience as an endoscopy nurse unit manager and coordinator. Her first ANZGITA program was in Myanmar in 2015 at our first training program in Myanmar, and she's been to 4 programs in Myanmar from 2015 to 17. She's been to Nepal twice and been a key person from the nursing side in our training activities in Kathmandu. She's got great leadership in both Myanmar and Nepal, and establish nurse training in those locations. So we're trying to find the certificate for Anne. Is it there, Frank? There it is.
Sorry.
Thank you, Anne, and congratulations on your work, and thank you so much for all you've done for ANZGITA. So the second one I mentioned is Mark Norrie. I've mentioned Mark already. He's our country program lead in the Solomons, where he's really been the foundation and backbone to our activities in the Solomons. He's been there 6 times and leads the program jointly with Eileen Natutsi from California. He's also been to 2 Myanmar programs, so overall he's been to 6 of our training programs over time. So thank you, Mark, and congratulations for all your work for ANZGITA. And finally, we have an industry partner who we'd like to acknowledge and provide Mario Kutz with a certificate. Mario's never said no to about anything we've asked for in terms of provision of endoscopy accessories and equipment. He's been very responsive to Di Jones and Chris Hare's calls, passed on 2 large pallets of consumables to Timor-Leste last year alone, and a large donation of biopsy forceps was sent to the Northern Pacific at the drop of a hat last year when it was needed in Palau. And he's currently working to provide very discounted price for Varisil bandits for units across the ANZGITA platform. So thank you very much, Mario. You've been a great support to us and we greatly appreciate it. So it's my pleasure now to move on to introduce our speaker, Michael Wesley. Michael is the International Vice Chair, Vice Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne. Also, as I've said, a member of our advisory group. He's had extensive experience in international strategy and relations in government, the private sector and higher education, and responsible for leading the University of Melbourne's international engagement. He has published on Australian foreign policy, Asia's international relations and strategic affairs, and the politics of state-building interventions. Previously, he was Professor of International Affairs and Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU and Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at ANU, and also Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy, Director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University and Assistant Director General of Transnational Issues at the Office of National Assessments. Got a PhD in International Relations from the University of St Andrews. So, Michael, thank you very much for offering to inform us on, we've entitled it The Role of ANZ NGOs in the Contemporary Pacific, but Michael's going to put a slightly different slant and perspective on our work and on the geopolitics of the region.
Finlay, thank you, and good evening to everyone, and congratulations on ANZGITA and its wonderful record. What terrific work you're doing. Look, I just wanted to spend 15 minutes or so just talking a little bit about the geopolitics of the primary region that you're working in, or one of the primary regions that you're working in, which is the South Pacific. I understand that ANZGITA is working in Asia as well, but much of its work happens in the South Pacific, and it's an area that I've been watching quite closely in my own scholarly work, and I thought I'd speak a little bit about that. The South Pacific is, of course, incredibly important in geopolitical terms for Australia and New Zealand. Both countries are geographically part of the South Pacific, and since European colonisation have really seen the South Pacific as their area or their sphere of influence, if you like. In fact, both countries have been motivated since European colonisation by a fear that hostile interests would come and establish themselves in the South Pacific. Originally, those hostile interests from the middle of the 19th century were the French. We became worried about the Russians for a little while. The Germans really concerned us. For a short period of time, the Americans concerned us when they moved into places like Hawaii and Samoa. And then more recently, we were very worried about the Soviets establishing a foothold in the South Pacific. So you could say that the original motivation for both Australia and New Zealand foreign policy is to make sure that South Pacific remains an area where we are the major international partners for South Pacific Island countries, and no countries that we regard as hostile to our interests establish a foothold in the South Pacific. So obviously, we have been becoming increasingly concerned in recent years, particularly over the last decade, with a growing Chinese presence in the South Pacific. China has three real motivations for being in the South Pacific. The first and most original one, of course, is its competition with Taiwan for diplomatic recognition. Currently, 5 of the 17 countries that recognize Taiwan and not China as the legitimate government of one China are in the South Pacific. Taiwan obviously wants to maintain those numbers, if not grow them, whereas the People's Republic of China would like to decrease the number of countries that recognize Taiwan. And so there's an intense diplomatic competition that's going on between China and Taiwan. And of course, last year, the Solomon Islands was the most recent country to switch its recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. Another impetus for China being in the South Pacific is thousands of Chinese business people who have migrated under their own steam into the South Pacific and set up businesses in the South Pacific, where really in most countries they have come to dominate the retail sector in the South Pacific. The third impetus is strategic competition with the United States. The United States and China are locked into a strategic rivalry in the Pacific, and this has meant that the South Pacific has become one of those arenas of competition between the United States and China. And so China has been expanding its presence really quite rapidly in the South Pacific. It has done this under commercial terms, where China is now the #1 trading and investment partner for most of the countries of the South Pacific, displacing Australia and New Zealand in that position. It has also been a major contributor in economic development aid and assistance to the South Pacific as well, rapidly becoming the second largest contributor of overseas development assistance to the South Pacific after Australia. There are other forms of Chinese influence there as well, of course. President Xi Jinping of China has now engaged in 2 leader-to-leader summits with South Pacific leaders and has made a number of visits into the South Pacific. So this has caused, naturally, quite a bit of alarm, not only in Australia and New Zealand, but also in the United States. And basically, all 3 countries, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, have moved into what I would call a period of direct competition with China, trying to counter each of the elements of Chinese influence with their own elements. One example is that in order to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is, of course, a global spanning initiative for China to help build infrastructure of economic connectivity between China and other countries, that has extended to the South Pacific. Australia, New Zealand, and the United States have countered with their own infrastructure initiative in the South Pacific. The idea, as former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop of Australia, Julie Bishop, said is to remove the incentive of South Pacific states to improve their collaborative arrangements with China by giving them much more attractive terms from Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And a classic example of this is that Australia has offered to build an internet cable between the South Pacific countries like Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and Australia, rather than have those be built by Chinese companies such as Huawei. The South Pacific is watching all of this geopolitical competition with a little bit of bemusement, you must say. It's quite interesting because the South Pacific has really gained its own real geopolitical voice in amongst this competition between China, Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And the key message here is that the South Pacific simply refuses to buy into the sort of Cold War competition that it sees as being developed in the region. Let me quote from the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame Meg Taylor. She had this to say last year, quote, "I reject the terms of the dilemma which presents the Pacific with a choice between a China alternative and our traditional partners, meaning Australia and New Zealand. In general, forum members view China's increased actions in the region as a positive development, one that offers greater options for financing and development opportunities, both directly in partnership with China and indirectly through increased competition in our region." In another quote, she says, "If there is one word that might resonate among all forum members when it comes to China, that word is access. Access to markets, technology, financing, infrastructure, access to a viable future." So there you can, unquote, there you can see there's a very clear divide between the way that Australia and New Zealand see China's influence in the Pacific and the way that small island states in the Pacific see China's influence in the Pacific. There's another element here as well, and that is that while Australia and New Zealand see competition in the Pacific as the key security interest, that is not the way that the countries of the South Pacific see it. In a statement released last year called the Boy Declaration, the countries of the South Pacific Island Forum listed climate change and transnational security challenges such as organised crime as the key security challenges facing the South Pacific. They simply refused to buy into this geopolitical competition between China, Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And so this is the geopolitical tension into which ANZGITA is working and will need to negotiate. There's a couple of issues here to watch out for. One is that there are slow divisions developing in certain Pacific Island countries. There is a perception in certain countries, such as the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, that governments have become supposedly bought by the large amounts of cash flowing into the Pacific by these competing geopolitical powers. And so there is a growing cynicism that governments can be trusted to manage the national affairs and the public interest of Pacific Island societies. The second element to watch here is a growing divide between government and populace. As you go from different South Pacific society to different South Pacific society, there is a growing resentment at Chinese economic dominance of economies in the South Pacific. There's a perception that Chinese small business, particularly in the retail sector, is taking business away from Pacific Island small business and sewing up the profits and excluding the people of Pacific Island societies from economic prosperity. This is becoming, I think, a key fracture issue in the South Pacific. And finally, there is a really big public policy issue that the Australian government has not confronted, and that is the growing divide between the South Pacific and Australia on the issue of climate change. Countries in the South Pacific see climate change not as something that is happening in the future, but as an existential issue that confronts them every single day. And they simply cannot believe that a country like Australia that sees itself as part of the South Pacific can continue to do things like export large amounts of coal. And so this is a major issue that the Australian government has failed to address and will be an erosive factor between Australia and what it sees as its partners in the South Pacific. So to sum up, I'm almost out of time. What does this mean for ANZGITA, and what does this mean for your work in the South Pacific? I would argue that this geopolitical competition makes ANZGITA's work in the South Pacific even more crucial than it has been in the past. Because ANZGITA represents a crucial element of soft power for Australia and New Zealand into the South Pacific. In my view, Australia and New Zealand have committed a dreadful policy mistake in seeking to compete head-to-head with China in the South Pacific, with trying to neutralise what China is doing. Australia and New Zealand have an advantage in the South Pacific that China will never have, which is over a century of deep people-to-people links and people-to-people affections in the South Pacific. The work that ANZGITA is doing is bolstering that work. It is playing directly into the policy agendas of Pacific organisations such as the Pacific Island Forum and the South Pacific Commission. The South Pacific Commission in particular has become increasingly engaged with health issues in the South Pacific, particularly around non-communicable diseases. And so the work of ANZGITA is working directly into maintaining and bolstering Australia and New Zealand's soft power in the South Pacific. This should be the basis of your work and your relationships with DFAT and other funders, and you should be every day making the point that your work, in addition to advancing the health outcomes among vulnerable communities in the South Pacific, is actually supporting and building on Australia and New Zealand's geopolitical ambitions and aims in the South Pacific. Finlay, I've taken up the time allotted to me. I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to take questions and engage in discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was really, really insightful presentation, and resonates a lot with my observations of being across the Pacific, what you've said. So it was terrific to hear somebody of your background and perspective hear what you had to say. So, Frank, I do note there are a few questions there. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yes, and I have got couple of questions already, but then if people have a question, Finn, then they can use the Q&A button to put some questions forward as well. But one question that's come in is whether Michael has any views on how we best gain the attention and confidence of DFAT, and should we be approaching DFAT more proactively than we might have in the past to position ourselves with them as an NGO operating in the Pacific?
Absolutely. And my view is the best way for ANZGITA to approach DFAT is in partnership with one of the South Pacific regional organisations. So one of the things I would like to help ANZGITA with is to make connections into one of the South Pacific regional organisations, particularly one of those that is interested in and concerned about health outcomes. Health outcomes, as I don't need to tell all of you, in the South Pacific are trending in the wrong direction. The South Pacific, with a couple of honourable exceptions, is going in the wrong direction in terms of the sustainable development goals that relate to health. And this is becoming a real concern of South Pacific regional organisations. Australia is the largest donor to South Pacific regional organisations. It listens very closely to the agendas of South Pacific regional organisations. And I think that if ANZGITA wanted to make a clearer pitch to DFAT for partnership and support, it would be very strongly helped if there was one of those South Pacific or several of those South Pacific regional organisations alongside it, advocating the work of ANZGITA and helping ANZGITA to open doors and make its case within DFAT. That would be, I think, a really strong coalition for ANZGITA to make use of.
Thanks, Michael. I've got another question. This is from Des Ledden, who spoke earlier. Des is with the WGO. He asks, how should ANZGITA engage on the climate issue?
Look, ANZGITA should engage in a very principled way on the climate issue. It should not be worried about offending the Australian government on this issue. The one thing that resonates in the South Pacific is authenticity. And the one thing that turns the people of the Pacific off is a sense of hypocrisy or inauthenticity. And that's the biggest stumbling block that the Australian government faces at the moment. The Australian government acts in a very weak way on climate change. And yet when the Australian Prime Minister and other ministers go into the South Pacific, they try and fudge the issue of climate change. ANZGITA, I think, would be well served in the Pacific by taking a principled stand on climate change. All of the members of ANZGITA are scientists. All of the members of ANZGITA are people, I think, who would be strong believers in and supporters of the scientific evidence. And all of the members of ANZGITA are influential members of society who I think could lend their voices to the imperative of taking really strong and fast action on climate change. If you were to do that as an organisation, I think that would immeasurably build your legitimacy in the Pacific. Not that you need legitimacy in the Pacific. You are obviously doing a lot of wonderful volunteer work to help vulnerable populations in the Pacific in health terms. But I think having a strong view on climate change, one that talks about the existential threat that climate change poses to societies in the South Pacific, would only bolster that legitimacy in the region.
Thanks, Michael. Got another question, which is taking a slightly different tack, is that given your current role at the University of Melbourne, do you see a role for students in working in NGOs like us or others when doing our work in the Pacific?
Absolutely, I do. Two things I can observe here. The first one is our students increasingly want to give back. one of the things that I love about our students is that they come to university not as students 25 or 30 years ago who are focused very much on their own careers and their own development over time. Our students are increasingly idealistic. They come to university because they want to make a difference in the world. And therefore, they want university courses that engage their moral sense, their sense of moral activism and moral agency. The second thing I would observe, and this is very clearly documented as well, we've got very clear data on this, is that we have rising demand from among our student body that they want to spend a segment of their education overseas working on practical issues. And so we can barely keep up with the demand from our students to go overseas to do important things that make the world a better place. And so what I would love to do, and it's in fact one of the internal KPIs that I've set myself, is to make sure that more of our students at the University of Melbourne spend time some time in their degrees, travelling into the South Pacific and working in ways that help to make the South Pacific a better place. As I said, there's a lot of challenges in the South Pacific. The evidence around the Sustainable Development Goals is stark. There is a great deal of research and knowledge that we must offer as part of our membership in the South Pacific. We have an obligation to do it, and I think our students are a big part of our obligation to take our knowledge and to put it to good in the South Pacific. And I look forward to the opportunity in partnering with ANZGITA and other NGOs in the South Pacific in enabling us to do that.
Frank, Kiki just asked a question, and I think I scrubbed it off by mistake, but he basically asked how can Asian and other Indo-Pacific stakeholders have more engagement in the governance and advisory roles for ANZGITA. So turning it around the other way. And he's addressed that to me, seeing I rubbed it off the questions, I thought I should answer it. Well, we do try. I mean, we're privileged to have Joseph Song and KL Go operating in those roles, but we're also keen to have others. And Kiki brings to mind the real possibility that we should have Kiki or some other members like Berlin and involved in our advisory group as well. So I think we'll take that away to the board to consider, for the board to consider. Thank you for the question, Kiki.
Okay, Finn, I think given the time, perhaps if you would thank Michael on our behalf.
Yes, Michael. Well, you've really lifted the AGM to a high level, and it's been very engaging in a pretty sensitive area that we all know as we work through the Indo-Pacific region. And it's been wonderful to have your insights and your external validation of what we do. So thank you very much, Michael. And thank you for your ongoing contribution to our advisory group. And we'll pick up some of those leads that you've mentioned during your talk offline afterwards. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
My watch says we've got 3 minutes to go, Frank. Is that right?
Mine says we've got a couple. But Finn, if you like, I think what we could do is if you close the meeting officially.
Meeting, yes.
And then, but then we do have a couple of other questions that have come in for you from your previous talk. So perhaps we could go to those after you've done that.
Okay, so thank you for everybody attending the AGM. I'd like to declare it closed. We will be back in the Pacific as soon as COVID allows us to do that on the ground. and we look forward to what is over now 200 members of ANZGITA as part of our organisation, the majority of which have been participant members, nurses and doctors in those many centres across the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you very much to all the members, both the 60 or so that are registered for the AGM and the balance of the all 200. We wouldn't be an organisation without our membership. So thank you very much for everybody for your great work. And I declare the meeting closed.
Okay. But there's a few questions. So if people do have the time to stay on and wish to, then there are a few more questions which we'll just go through. Ian Turner, Finn, has asked, I think you sort of tried to answer this already, whether there's any, or will programs only restart when the vaccine for COVID-19 is available, and has there been any guidance from DFAT on that?
Well, Joseph Sung actually led our advice on this back in the early part of 2020, and we may well lean on him again, but we were pretty keen to keep pushing ahead beyond the Solomons. He trimmed our sails a bit, and we might well be leaning on lots of opinions, but his was quite influential given what we knew of Joseph's management of epidemics in Hong Kong over the years, personal management of Hong Kong epidemics. So no doubt we'll call on Joseph and indeed government sources, notwithstanding we can't get there unless the airlines are flying.
Karen Kempen is keen to join the ANZGITA WhatsApp group. She wants to know what the process is to do that.
It's just getting underway, Karen. Mark Norrie has, of course, generated a great WhatsApp group around the Solomons, and we're in discussions with Mark about extending that further. So it's work in progress. I think what we'll be doing is sending a general invitation to the membership about how to join the WhatsApp group, and we'll just see how it develops. We may need some infrastructure support around it, maybe with a bit of help from Barb. I don't know. We'll see how it runs.
Okay. And talking of Barb, this is a question for Barb, I think. Madhav Akraya, I'm sorry, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, Madhav.
Yeah.
Says, I really love the concept of ANZGITA. I've worked in a couple of endoscopy units in the last 2 years. Most of the people, they don't know anything about ANZGITA. Is there anything I can do so that it'll make it possible for more people to get involved?
Absolutely, there's something you can do. We've developed this PowerPoint presentation, so it can either be presented as a formal presentation, say in a boardroom or as part of a meeting, or on an iPad as a flip book. And it just gives you 10 slides to talk to. We'll support you with all the information you need. Talks all about ANZGITA. And easy to send to you to learn more and to hopefully tell others about us.
Yeah, and we'll have a link to that.
We'll send a link this week in a spring newsletter to everyone. We'll announce it in there along with the socks and the annual report. So yes, we're happy and encouraging everyone to please let other people know in any format, whether it's a small group at lunch or a bigger group, to tell them about ANZGITA. Thank you.
Okay, and then Finn, just thanks. Anne Vanderloo, Mario Kutz, Mark Norrie have registered their thanks for the recognition awards that you've proposed tonight.
Please let them know. We will send them a formal certificate very soon in the mail.
Okay. I haven't got any more questions here. I don't have, let me just check. Oh, hang on. What's Barb? Right. Oh, okay. Chris, yeah, Chris is making a suggestion here. A bit more work for you, Barb, about maybe a short video of that PowerPoint. Okay, we can take that up with Chris.
It'll
So
be a
that,
flip book, so that does become a bit of a video,
yeah,
miniature video.
but I think, yeah, okay, and we can, yeah,
We'll do
there's
that.
some other improvements we can do to that. Okay, Finn, that's all the questions that we've got.
So thank you everyone for joining us for the hour, and we look forward to your further engagement either online or in person as COVID passes us. Thanks very much, everybody, for being on the line. I see Fiona's there as well. Thanks, Fiona, and everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Finn.
Yep.
Righto.
Okay.
Bye.